Welcome back. Now turning our attention to politics, specifically preparations for the Kogi and the Bayelsa governorship elections. We do have here with us Mr. Clement Wankwo, who is the Executive Director, Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, PLAC. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you, Chamberlain.
Well, we're looking to see how, usually many want to see what will the improvements be this time. What is INEC going to do differently such that people can indeed, at the end of the day, thump their chest and say, well, yes, the process went smoothly. We've heard previous, INEC speaks a lot. They meet with groups a lot before elections. But at the end of the day, there's usually big question marks. So the kind of conversation that you're having this time, is there anything to inspire confidence that these ones will go differently?
Well, I think always it's important for us to help to build confidence in INEC, because if people start out without confidence in INEC, then there's no point going on with the election. So I think it's important that confidence in the electoral process is there and people feel inspired by what they see to come out and vote. Certainly, this would be the first elections that INEC would be conducting, or the first major election INEC will be conducting since the general elections of 2019. And as well, the first governorship election to be conducted since the Osun elections last year. And Osun elections ended in a very sad note, what we call Osun 2. Osun 1 went well, which means that people were satisfied with the conduct of it. Osun 2 was a disaster, I would say. And I think people were very dissatisfied with that. And my hope is that INEC has taken lessons from the failure of Osun 2 and has taken lessons as well from the challenges with the 2019 general elections. In conversations with INEC, like you said, is always quite happy to have conversations with stakeholders, and we've had conversations with INEC where we've been assured that preparations are in place. The voters register is ready, has been handed over to the political parties. Today is, I think tomorrow is the last day for accreditation of polling agents by the political parties. Observers have been accredited, 67, 68 in the two states respectively. So in a lot of ways, we've been assured that they are ready. We've been assured additionally that for the first time, INEC has developed what it calls rules of engagement for security with the elections. And as you know, Osun 2 and indeed a large part of the 2019 general elections was marred by the interference by the military in an unprecedented manner. Having been part of the struggle against military rule to keep the military away from government, it is very disappointing to see the military increasingly getting involved in our politics, in our elections.
Sorry to jump in. Are there indications that that may change? Because I know that the last time INEC had they tried to have an engagement in Bayelsa. We saw how it ended because the parties just wouldn't agree concerning what to do about certain centers concerning security.
I think that, of course, both states are hotspot states for INEC and indeed for observers, and we are all very apprehensive with respect to the elections, especially also because the primaries of the two major parties in the two states were clouded in confusion and certainly not with respect. They didn't respect their internal rules and processes. But we're hoping that we have come out of that and that with respect to the elections itself, that the rules that INEC says it has created, we haven't seen the rules of engagement. We're hoping that that rule would have been shared with stakeholders so that they can also make an input. But certainly, this country cannot continue on the trajectory of the military getting involved.
Is there any timeline concerning when those rules will be made public?
INEC has indicated it will make those rules available to stakeholders at the stakeholders meetings it is conducting in Bayelsa and Kogi states on the 7th and 11th of November, respectively. So we are hoping to get a first chance to look at it. Unfortunately, it would be a fait accompli. We would be presented with it. So if we have questions about it, we may not be able to make inputs.
Short response before we go to break. You talked about this confidence thing. How confident are you about this election coming up in Kogi and Bayelsa?
Well, I can only rely on the assurances given by INEC about its preparation.
So from your own observer's, perspective.
We're still observing. We're still observing.
Are you trying to get him to give a scorecard already?
He's the guest. Don't ask me, ask him.
We're still observing. INEC has said what it has said. Ours is to measure INEC's statements by what happens on the field.
But from some of the recommendations already, the process is the mode of voting, transmission of results. At least they've spoken up about some of those ones. It's going to be transmitted manually. They will still accredit voters with the vote card readers. What about that point where I know that the last time out they had questions about whether people will be accredited, vote, or get accredited, wait until we know the total number of people accredited before the voting starts. How are parties responding to that now?
I think what has happened is that with the general elections, we've gone past the accreditation and then come back to vote. Both of it now is simultaneous. So as you accredit or you are accredited, you vote. I think the more concerning aspect of elections, and it has always been so, is the collation. And because voting usually starts later than the time indicated, it means that by the time you finish voting in the polling unit, it's already running into the evening hours. And then materials begin to move to the different collation centers, and it goes into the night. And at that stage, the security forces take over. And that's where the challenge
is. That deliberate?
I don't know, but apparently that seems to be the pattern. And I think it's something that, given the improvements we have seen with the electoral process, I do not see why you cannot finish. If you start at 8 a.m. to vote, I do not see why you cannot finish in good time to be able to allow collation to happen quite earlier than happens as it is at this time. So I think it's something that INEC needs to do to improve transparency in the electoral process, that collation starts early enough, and you should be able to get a sense of attaining some finality to collation in daylight. And I think unless we can do that, the challenges of darkness comes in.
Darkness, both metaphorically,
metaphorically and
literally. But some people will talk about perhaps INEC should set a time frame for when elections cannot go beyond. We do know that sometimes voting materials arrive at polling booths late. People don't get to start on time or when they ought to have to. I think a particular case comes to mind in Lagos. I'm trying to remember the particular local government now, but materials are not deployed until about 12 or 3 or thereabout, between 12 and 3, before elections got to start in the general elections, and just concluded general elections. I'm imagining a situation where INEC will say, yes, the official time is 4 o'clock, but for whatever reasons, materials don't get there on time, you start late. By 7 o'clock, if you haven't completed voting, they might need to abort the process. I don't know. Will things like that, will measures like that work, just to avoid this nighttime voting?
Given the number of polling units and what INEC now calls voting points that are established, I do not see why voting should exceed early afternoon. I think it should be possible, if INEC starts on time, that voting should end by early afternoon. And collation, time minimizes, because once you've finished collating at a polling unit, the rest is just so very easy. And certainly, it's a question of adding numbers from different units. And if everybody is ready at the same time, I do not see why you cannot have your figures ready on time.
You see a lot of political parties still kicking against us to retain us accreditation and voting. They're still saying, we wanted INEC to go back to the old system, the system adopted in 2015, whereby there was accreditation first before voting, even though there have been questions as to whether there's been any significant difference in the figures that we noticed in the 2019 elections versus the 2015 elections. Nonetheless, parties believe that it will curb rigging to a large extent if people were accredited first and voted later. What do you say?
Why this was changed, and we, from the Situation Room, we're quite active in advocating for that change. Why it was changed was because when people go out, they accredit, some come by 8 o'clock, get accredited, go back home, and they're expected to come back at 12 to vote, the reality is a lot of people don't show up.
Indeed.
And when the numbers drop, the political parties then sit down and vote to fill up the gap.
Oh.
They share the votes.
So we're still in the state of jeopardy anyway.
So those were the things we observed that made us say, look, make it simultaneous.
Oh.
And part of the problem also is you have, and you would notice the number of votes dropped in a whole. Lagos, for instance, the voter turnout was very low. And that was because there was suppression of votes. And suppression of votes includes deliberate disruption in delivery of materials, logistics. All of these issues are major issues. And part of the reform of the electoral process is that you must create a logistics system that works effectively.
Sorry, I really want him to elaborate on that because, I mean, that suppression of votes, I mean, people will say it happens in many ways. It happens with security agencies taking over. It happens with thugs taking over a particular area with the connivance, of course, of those around. It happens with logistics, not happening. How is INEC responding to that? If Lagos is an obvious example of suppression of votes, how have they responded to that particular? Has there been an investigation, for instance, to say this was what happened in Lagos, and we'll make sure it doesn't repeat itself?
It's going to be up to INEC to tell us how it is responding, but our observation is that it happens, like you said, in different manners. And so the question is, if it continuously happens, you keep doing the same thing and it keeps giving you the same result, which is failure, then you must ask yourself, what should you do differently? And that's what INEC needs to ask itself. How do you distribute materials? The amount of money spent and the amount of human resources, including the use of the army, the navy, police, and so on, to distribute materials, costs incredibly a lot. And yet, you're not getting the results that you desire. So the question is, and what are other countries doing that is different? Can you get logistics companies to deliver, to handle this? The question of storage of sensitive materials in the central bank, there were even allegations that these were being tampered with in the central bank. Now, is it possible that you can have companies, the banks, for instance, have branches across the country? Is it possible that you can actually take materials, sensitive materials, and contract it to banks, depending on where their strengths are, such that they now take responsibility and are held to account for distribution of materials?
Just quickly, a response to this. INEC is concerned about vote buying. That's one of their major concerns for the Kogi and the Bayelsa elections. Do you share the same concerns as they do?
About security?
About vote buying.
Well, it's been there, and it's a question, how do you respond to that? The political parties also have a role to play, but vote buying is a major issue, and it continuously gets sophisticated in the way it is done. We saw it in Ekiti. Ekiti was one of the most bizarre, where monies were actually being paid into people's accounts before election day, and others actually had the money standing next to
And no one has been arrested for that.
And no one has been arrested. So are you prosecuting election offenders? What is the steps being taken by government to make sure that people are prosecuted or apprehended and prosecuted?
One of the concerns that you and many other observers raised during in the aftermath of the general elections, the last general elections that you referenced earlier, is that of how frequently or not people came out to vote. Many people were said to not have come out to vote, low voter turnout and all of that. Do you see that being repeated, or do you see an improved voter education exercise gone towards this Kogi and Bayelsa elections?
No, with Kogi and Bayelsa, the voter education has been poor. Don't forget that in the two states, a lot of the political parties, their method of selection of candidates was not transparent. And so when you have unpopular candidates emerge in the parties, the enthusiasm amongst the electorate would be reduced. And the parties have not done very much. I have not seen a lot of campaign going on amongst the candidates to turn out the votes. INEC, of course, has a responsibility to create awareness about the nature of ballot paper and the method of voting. But with respect to selling themselves, the candidates, I don't see a lot of that going on. And if that is not going on, it's going to be a question, how many people are you able to mobilize, energize to come out and vote? And if that's the case, if you can't mobilize a lot, you would still suffer from low voter turnout.
So then you're saying that this election is going to be very expensive, uninspiring.
Expensive elections in this country have unfortunately become expensive, and we need to find ways, and it's a separate conversation. How can you minimize the cost of elections, both in terms of election administration costs, but also campaign costs, and indeed getting nominated costs. So all of those costs add up so much. But the key thing is the question, how do you get people to see that there is an important need for them to come out and vote? And even in the choice of uninspiring candidates, and I agree with you in terms of the candidates, what are the choices you have? There must be some lesser evil than the other.
So, but if you said that there's some things that the political parties ought to have done, ought to have been doing, that they haven't taken any step in doing until now. So who is holding them to account, given that they have also collected subventions from INEC, I believe?
No, they don't.
Okay, so who is holding them to account? Why do they contest elections if they do not, carry the people that are supposed to vote for them along?
I think there's a sense, and you could see that with the last general elections where debates were being organized, and some parties just scorned the debates because in a lot of ways, their calculation of how they get elected sometimes hardly takes the people into account. And that's why all of the abuses with the election process is there.
So where does this leave the electorate?
I think it's a very difficult situation for the electorate because in a lot of instances, candidates are elected or emerge as winners with a lot of electorate not being part of that process, which is sad for elections.
I want to go back to the issue of security, and I know that it has been a great issue raised with the issue of the military being involved in our elections. There are fears. I mean, I think you heard there, the candidate of the PDP talking about security agencies mopping up arms before the elections in Kogi State. There are serious fears about election violence, even though the governor maintains, who's also one of the contestants in the race, maintains that it's not what is being painted. It's not as bad as it's being painted in the media. Or maybe we're the ones who are giving it a differentiate. I don't know. But there are fears about election violence. Can we really go into those or that particular election without the aid or the assistance of the military in Kogi State or Bayelsa State?
I will have difficulty in supporting any military involvement in elections in Nigeria because of the experience that we have had with the military in this country. And it is troubling for me to see...
Is it previously or military in elections?
Military involvement in the conduct of elections, I think, should be severely minimized or completely erased. And I say that because when you see the police is the best trained agency to get involved in elections. And we must equip the police, especially when you have, as we have today, police leadership that people have some confidence in.
Is the experience I'm referring to, when you say with regards with our experience with the military, I'm talking about, is it with elections or in just general life?
Now the police, and this is very troubling, the police, a few days to the conduct of the Kogi and Bayelsa, the military, a few days to the conduct of Kogi and Bayelsa elections, announced what it called Operation Positive Identification. You will observe that each time major elections approaches, the military will announce a major operation. And according to its operation, this will start on the first day of November and end slightly after the elections in Kogi and Bayelsa. The question is, why is the military always mobilized to go into the civilian population across the country when elections are due? So I worry about the military getting involved in our elections because the experience has not been positive.
But unfortunately, some people have also said that, the presence of the military helps keep sanity.
No, the presence of the military in a lot of ways creates fear.
But can we categorize that? Because when we talk about involvement of the military, is it that they don't have to be where the battle is, or just stay at a reasonable distance so that the police will be in the front lines, or no presence at all?
If you've observed elections, especially governorship elections that happens, the military claims that they are not in the polling unit, and that's fine. But they are involved in the boundaries. They are involved in the boundaries between local governments. They're involved in the borders of the state. And in the last elections, observers were being detained by the military. So all of these experiences make us very, very concerned about the military's involvement in elections. And the Civil Defense Corps, the police, have enough personnel to be able to provide security for elections.
Do they have the capacity as well?
What's the capacity? If the capacity is capacity for brutality, that's not what you need during elections. What you need is the capacity to restrain those who want to perpetrate violence.
That's the capacity I'm referring to.
Well, I think that if you equip the police to do so, and the problem is that we continue to subjugate the police. We continue to not provide the resources for the police. We continue to not provide equipment for them. And as long as this country continues to see a situation where the military gets involved in civil activities, then for so long will the society be militarized.
But when they have that security meeting with INEC and all those security agents, one expects that they usually should have or could have sorted it out at that point before they then get into the elections proper.
Which is another issue, because when you have the police and civil defense, they often are happy to work with INEC. The military tells you that their only commander is the commander-in-chief, and they do not take instructions from anybody else. But with respect to elections, and the Electoral Act is very clear about it, every person takes directives from INEC and should take directives from INEC. And that was the point we articulated very strongly with the 2019 elections, that INEC should define rules of engagement. INEC never did that.
So if they do it and specify what the military can do, how is that going to function, especially in the light of what the army says that, look, our CNC is who we take orders from?
Well, that's the point. The CNC is who they take orders from with respect to wars, not elections. An election is not war. But if you decide to leave your military duties on your own volition and create an involvement in elections, then you must be subject to the directive and control of the body charged with management of elections, and that's INEC.
How do you see that playing out this time around? Because over the past few months in the run-up to the elections, the general elections that just ended, we had that agency of all security agencies, including the military and the police, where the INEC makes it known that it's the police that is the lead agency, but then we still have that altercation between, unclear, chain of command between the Nigerian police and the Nigerian army when it comes to the elections. How do you see that playing out going forward?
Well, it never plays out well because the military never accepts that the police is the lead agency on security, even if they say it.
Even if it's in civil affairs like the elections?
Even if they say it, and even if it's with respect to elections, our experience has shown that even if the chairman of INEC is the head of the Interagency Committee on Election Security, even if the INEC chairman is co-chair with the National Security Advisor, and in the states, the Commissioner of Police is the chair of that committee with INEC, it never happens that when soldiers are deployed that they agree to taking instructions from INEC or from the police. And that's why, and they are not suited or kitted to maintain civil order.
Are we having this conversation with the military? I mean, how are they responding to the criticisms that have been raised with their involvement in elections?
We did raise those criticisms. Yeah. The Chief of Army Staff, with respect to the last elections, because the criticisms were so very high, the videos that were put out on the media was so very blatant, that the Chief of Army Staff set up a committee to investigate the role of the Army in the 2019 elections. And we provided evidence to that committee. What came out of it was a report that we actually didn't even see the details of that exonerated the military, even in the face of blatant facts.
All right, then. So that's where we leave it. Mr. Clement Wanko is Executive Director, Policy and Legal Advocacy Center. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you.